Welcome to Josie to Lagos. This is a podcast from Africa. It's a podcast for Africa. And the reason this podcast exists is because we simply don't have enough content about the continent from young, passionate people who live in the continent, young scholars, young thinkers. We need this content. Here it is. Today, I'm actually doing something totally different. I'm doing my first interview, and it's pre-recorded, so some of the elements of the interview may have changed by the time that you listen to this, but the content, I think, is timeless. It's classic, like a Nas album. So, who am I talking to? I'm talking to Dr. Sizwe Mpofu Walsh, and he's actually a very cool guy as a person, very chilled, but his mind is so brilliant. He studied at Oxford. Before that, he was at UCT. Before that, he was at St. John's College. And in all of his journeys, he has really been pushing the academic needle, trying to be the Michael Jordan, the LeBron James of knowledge. And I think he's achieved that. He got his PhD from Oxford quite recently. And we're going to be talking today about knowledge formation, looking at it from the Africa perspective. Now, if you've never heard of Dr. Sizwe Mpofu Walsh, he's many things. He wears many hats. He's an academic. I've mentioned that. He's a rapper. He's got a rap album. You should actually check it out. It's pretty dope. And he's written a book called Democracy and Delusion. It's an amazing piece of literature, and it's quite incisive, brilliant, and concise in how it explores some of the biggest debates in South Africa and casts truth on a lot of misinformation. He's also the host of a multimedia show which also exists in podcast format called SMWX. SMWX. You can find it on all podcasting platforms. You can find it on YouTube as well. So let's listen to the conversation that we had. Well, thanks so much for joining us, Dr. Sizwe Mpofu Walsh. Do you like to be called doctor, or do you prefer people acting like they don't know that it happened?
Thanks so much. Well, it's growing on me. There's so many administrative things that have to happen before you can officially use the title. But it's just a matter of receiving a letter from Oxford. Everything that I need to do, I've done.
You've done. That's great. Great.
But when I receive that letter, don't worry. The Twitter bio will be updated.
All right. That's great, because we want to see that Black excellence celebrated. So, I mean, broadly today, we're talking about knowledge creation, especially in this new modern era with smartphones and social media and all of that. But before we go into that so much, you've been involved in Rhodes Must Fall at Oxford. And right now we're in the middle of, at the time of recording, of this Black Lives Matter resurgence, so to speak. So I wanted to ask you, what are your thoughts on the Black Lives Matter moment, having been part of a different movement around similar themes of white supremacy and, trying to, reform a space?
Well, I think one has to fight contending feelings of enthusiasm and cynicism at the same time. I think on the one hand, I'm extremely excited and enthusiastic about the scale and the scope of the Black Lives Matter moment, the way that it's particularly spread in Europe, which I think is probably the first of its kind at that scale in Europe. And I think the same is true, at least in terms of the size of the protests this decade, certainly in the US. But on the other hand, just as the struggle against white supremacy evolves, so white supremacy itself evolves. And I think that what we're seeing is also the evolution of lip service and the evolution of symbolic change without confronting the systemic change that's required. So even though I think the struggle has been advanced, we always need to remain vigilant and appreciate that progress is always in short supply.
Yeah, I wanna ask you about your reflections, having been at two places where, for instance, Rhodes has a prominent, positionality. Because a lot of people may not know this, but you were actually UCT SRC president while you were studying there. So, you were involved grassroots even there. So you move from UCT and you go to Oxford. And both of these places have ties to the man, Cecil John Rhodes. What are your thoughts on having been in the space and trying to motivate for decolonization of those spaces? Because I think de-slavery is not a word, but the Black Lives Matter movement is trying to do that, right? To unenslave themselves. And you've been part of these decolonization movements. And that's really what a lot of people miss, that it's not really about the statues or the symbols. It's about unraveling that knowledge structure. But now in 2020, looking back, what are your thoughts on all of those efforts?
Well, my journey, is one of increasing awakening. At UCT, I remember the statue, but I also remember a sense that it was immovable, that you couldn't even think about moving the statue. Like, you shouldn't even try. It just isn't worth your political time. And I recall, being in a few arguments, just personal arguments about the statue. But even as SRC president, it wasn't something that we set our sights on. And then when I went to Oxford, and I was like, whoa, okay, so this Rhodes chap is here as well. And then I learned a bit more about his life, learned that in fact he was actually at Oxford. And then there's something that happens when you go to Oxford, which is when you're in South Africa or when you're in other parts of the continent, you see the effects of the pillaging and the rapaciousness. But when you go to Europe and you go to Oxford, you see the spoils. And when you connect those two things together and you look at just the sheer amount of wealth that Rhodes took from Southern Africa and gave to Oxford, you see how these things connect. And that's really what motivated me to join and form part of and be one of the people who co-founded Rhodes Must Fall at Oxford. And we were inspired by what was happening back in South Africa, but we were also seeing Rhodes in a different light in his.
Because you were right there in a place that glorifies his stature, so to speak.
Exactly, and in fact, very, very literally idolizes him. And so now, when I look at the UK, I'm shocked at how people are pulling down statues, for example, of the slave owner Edward Coulston recently. And it's really encouraging to see that Rhodes Must Fall is reigniting and also restarting the call for Rhodes to fall. And I think it's testament to the notion that when you join these struggles, you don't progress is not guaranteed, but you plant a seed and you hope that seed keeps bearing fruit at different points throughout history.
I hear you. If I were to ask you about having been in these institutions, recently there's been a scandal with University of Cape Town where problematic research was done around why Blacks don't like science, and this time around it got called out. But I think because it happened in the George Floyd moment, it was easier for the university to take that stand. But I think what I want to ask you is, reflecting on having been at the number one university in Africa, to go to what some would say the number one university in the world, being Oxford. What are your thoughts around the knowledge and the content and the perspective that they create around Africa and Black people?
Well, I think it's a crucial site of struggle. And as is often the case, it's the sites of struggle that are the most hidden, that are often the most insidious. And so when you consider the knowledge economy, as it were, and the way that knowledge is produced in the world, it often follows very similar patterns to colonial patterns, in the 19th and 20th centuries. And that's not by mistake. It's because these empires and their excrescent current iterations are deeply linked to the way that knowledge is produced. And what's so fascinating is actually just how little these institutions with all this global cachet reckon with all of this. The conversation in Africa and Southern Africa is light years ahead of Oxford. So whereas you think you're going into a place where you're going to experience the best and the sharpest debate, you actually find that people are far behind the debate that's happening in Southern Africa. So there's an irony. These places are supposedly the best in the world, but in the former colonial outpost, you find debates far in advance of where they're happening, and that's extremely frustrating.
Okay, I hear you. Let me ask you something around these institutions. I've seen a lot of prominent African academics go to Oxford and Harvard and Yale, and some of them go to study, like African studies. So the point that you're raising is quite powerful for me, because you're saying that sometimes they go there and they find that these guys are actually behind the conversation, and maybe that's because of the nature of being far away from an issue. So you may think that you are still relevant, but you're light years behind. But when I was doing some reading, I found out that several of the prominent African thinkers, like Ngugi, are actually teaching, African literature and that kind of thing in universities in America and universities in the UK. What do you think that does for the generation of African knowledge if we have all of our bright stars? I mean, you buck the trend because you're back, but a lot of people stay there and participate in knowledge creation within those spaces which are not welcoming to the African narrative or even the African gaze, except for an African literature class or an African studies class, which isn't quite central to the curriculum. I don't know if you've thought about that or reflected on it in general.
No, definitely. It's a great tension, and it's a tension that I think confronts our generation on the continent and in South Africa as well. It's this idea that we now have the freedom to sell out if we want to. And that poses challenges that are very different to the liberation era, because the temptations and the incentives are very different. All I can say from my part is I'm very excited to be back in South Africa after having attended these institutions, because I think I wouldn't denigrate anyone for going there or even for staying there and retaining a serious link with their home country. But there's something about being back and having your fate tied to the continent and South Africa that is fundamentally different. And the sad thing is that because of colonial histories, because of apartheid, the kinds of opportunities that are available in South Africa, in the South African Academy, for example, are quite different to what they are in the States and in Europe, both in terms of how much they pay and how many there are. And that's something that, of course, we, as a generation of new academics, have to fight for.
Yeah. Do you think that the space is diversified? I remember watching a South African debate around Rhodes Must Fall. I think it was recorded in 2015, and universities were talking about how, they're doing their best to diversify their academy to make sure that they have prominent Black thinkers and in different fields. But Wits, for example, didn't have any in terms of serious numbers. And I'm thinking even now, many of the universities are still behind. Do you think that that's going to change in the short to medium term, especially considering that, there's not a lot of Black PhDs around to begin with, and you're competing with Harvard, Yale, Oxford, Cambridge, and so many other international organizations that can offer, the rewards that you were discussing?
Well, I think that's the struggle that confronts this generation. Although there are so few Black PhDs still, it's a sea change compared to where we were, say, 3 decades ago, and hopefully it will be a sea change 3 decades from now. And I think there's been a great deal of focus on the economy. There's been a great deal of focus on deracializing the electorate. But two extremely important fields in terms of the way we see the world, I think, need to really be focused and prioritized, and that's academia and media. And I think those are grounds for a new battle in the decades ahead.
Well, the topic of media is actually quite interesting because you have been trying to rejig how news is consumed by young people. How is that journey going? Because I know you've got the Sizwe Mpofu Walsh show, SMWX, right? Did I say it right?
Yep.
Did I get? Yeah. Okay. So you've got that, and you've got the podcast, you've got the YouTube channel, you have the WhatsApp platform. What has been your reflection on the creation of new knowledge using media as a platform and how people are responding to it?
I have to say, I'm quite disappointed at the South African media landscape. Having launched SMWX in 2019, last year, and being a lot closer to the South African media, and especially the agenda-setting South African media, I think we haven't even begun to appreciate A, its proximity to politics, B, the wealth that's in that space and how unequally distributed it is, and C, the racial dynamics that are still going on in the South African media, from ownership to editorial control, all the way to the way that stories are framed. And my experience within the media world has only reinforced what major problems these are. And this obviously has a spillover onto politics, economics, society in general, because the way we understand it through the media influences the way we practice. And so I really think it's absolutely crucial for any hope of democracy in South Africa that the media is fundamentally reformed.
But how would we go about that, considering the dynamics? Is it more channels like yours? I don't know if you can tell us if you are happy with the growth of the channel, for example, or the podcast community. I don't know whether a lot of people do consume podcasts in South Africa as compared to America and other iPhone-heavy countries. I don't know if you can tell us what you've been thinking about it, because you've correctly diagnosed the problem and you're obviously involved in trying to reshape the space. But what do you think needs to be done if people are listening thinking, hey, I need to change the way I consume this, or I need to be more active in challenging these platforms to change ABC? What are those reflections?
Well, I think it's really important that we use the new digital opportunity and we use it for a positive aim. There's obviously a danger that might be captured by the existing media juggernauts. But at the same time, I think there's a great need for a decentralized network of new voices with a new perspective to contest the established landscape. And I think that is most likely to happen in the digital media world because the barriers to entry are so low. I think SMWX is an interesting first experiment in that regard. We don't do any advertising. We just rely on word of mouth and hoping that people will resonate with the content. And it's done over 1 million views last year.
That's amazing.
It's heading towards 400,000 this year, bearing in mind that COVID really threw a spanner in the works in the last few months.
Absolutely.
So I think that just shows that people are hungry for the new kinds of content. But of course, SMWX just needs to be one piece in a much larger puzzle of different new voices contesting and framing in a different way.
Yeah, I hear you. What do you think about the role that social media is playing in the creation of narratives and knowledge? One of my feelings is that journalists rely too much on Twitter. It's almost as if they write only what is trending on Twitter. And sometimes it's of no value, but you still see it showing up in I don't know whether that's just because they are under deadlines, whether it's because people think it's cool to be topical and Twitter relevant. But one of my feedback points, if I were to give one, would be that it seems like Twitter is driving the media as opposed to the media trying to make a contribution which would be valuable to the Twitter audience and thus well accepted. So I don't know if you think the same or you've noticed different things, other things.
I think what you say is certainly true. I think there are great dangers to the social media age, both in terms of society, but also the way that we see ourselves, which I think affects society as well. I think that some of the dangers of Twitter for me include this extreme form of polarization where the algorithm seems to feed one warring faction with the content of another warring faction, and movements that start off with pure intentions always seem to degenerate into these wars of bots versus bots and comparisons to the most extreme forms of evil. And the way that conversations degenerate, I think, is quite detrimental to the democratic project. On the other hand, I think that because the barriers to entry on Twitter are lower, and obviously that has problems, it also allows people who don't have the resources or wouldn't have otherwise had the resources to reach. And that, I think, is an opportunity that needs to be seized, particularly in South Africa and in Africa. And also as an archive, I think it can be useful, to go back to things that now exist for public record. I think that's also crucial.
Well, it's interesting, because the point you make is a valuable one. I think Twitter has been very effective sometimes in pushing back on the mainstream media narratives that you were talking about that can be problematic because of the way the agenda is set. I think one key example for me was when the media wanted to paint Mama Winnie Mandela in one specific way, and they had already preloaded their content. It looks like it had been prepared months in advance. And on day one, they were like, this evil woman who did this and this. But Twitter was one of the most powerful platforms in saying, no, here's the narrative that we want. And then I remember a lot of media houses actually backtracked and actually gave a more respectful obituary. And that now has become what the line of march is, so to speak. So I think you're right in that respect. But I don't know whether, that point of the decline of debate, and the inappropriateness of the forum for debate is one that supersedes the other point around, pushing back on problematic media narratives. I don't know. What do you think?
Well, I think for me, I agree. It's difficult. It's difficult to determine, and I think at different points, the evils and the virtues become prominent. But I think one other drawback that we probably haven't reflected on sufficiently is the control of these platforms, and how, on the one hand, they seem to allow for democratic control, but when you really drill down, they're not even owned by South African corporations. They're owned by American corporations. And so I think they have their uses as long as you appreciate a certain degree of skepticism in terms of privacy, in terms of the way data is used, and the way that the algorithms can manipulate your feed, for example.
It's true. I think Facebook is more guilty of that nowadays than Twitter, because I remember somebody, a friend of mine, who was in my circle, but not so close that I would keep up to them on a day-to-day basis. So I used to rely on Facebook a lot, but I didn't notice when Facebook stopped giving me the content. And then one day, I think when I deliberately went to check, I found out that my friend had a baby. I was like, oh, that's like a whole year that I've missed. And this is someone close to me. I've got their number. So I call them and I congratulate them and stuff. But to me, the whole thing felt like something had gone wrong, because I was like, but this is, I was relying on Facebook to keep me posted, and when I went to the wall, I saw all of the posts. But at some point, the algorithm had decided that this wasn't really my friend. And so I didn't need to see that content. So it does worry me a little bit. And I'll tell you, one of the things that bothers me, even though I guess it didn't bother a lot of people, is when Twitter starts taking this editorial position that they have. Today it's Donald Trump and everyone is like, yay, screw Trump. But then when you look at everyone else, what happens when they censor Julius Malema, Musi Maimane, Cyril Ramaphosa? Because nothing precludes them from doing that, because we don't know the politics of Twitter. So now if they start being editors, will they rely on South African editors to help them evaluate South African content and flag it? And how does that all play out? And I feel like we need to be, preemptively vigilant around things like that, because
I couldn't agree. Yeah.
No, I mean, I'm thinking out loud, but go ahead.
Yeah, I couldn't agree more. And this is why I think that the location of ownership is key here, because if you don't appreciate the context of racism in South African history, then you can get lost in this colorblind definition that actually entrenches the problem. And I have very little faith in Twitter's editorial abilities. And also, it just doesn't seem to take Africa particularly seriously. I know that the head office is based in London, or at least certainly was until last year. You look at African major politicians, major authors, thinkers, artists, even celebrities, just totally unverified on Twitter.
Exactly.
And then you go to the US. There's like a blogger with 300 followers who's verified. Like what's going on here? So
and their process is obscure.
Completely. So even though Africa is one of the most dynamic spaces for Twitter, it just seems like they haven't taken it as seriously as they need to. And so you kind of feel like you're in this wild, wild west, excuse the pun. And and you have to just, and this is why I think in many ways, we haven't even started the conversation on white supremacy on South African Twitter, and just how unshackled it's become. It's almost become a new echo chamber for people to abuse people with no consequences, and it's really quite alarming.
Yeah, I'm reminded of one politician who said Twitter streets are rough, but I like that you bring up this point around supremacist groups on these platforms, because I have noticed that Twitter, YouTube, and Facebook, all of which have different forms of socialization, have become incubators of this kind of neo-supremacist, neo-nationalist party type of thinking. And it just seems to go under the radar by and large, unless there's some kind of outcry within the South African Twitter circles that's loud enough. So this cartoonist Germ, who made all of that problematic content, had been making problematic content for a very long time and was benefiting from the existence of this cabal. And I just don't know how we navigate that forward, because now these groups of people, they have YouTube channels and podcasts and Facebook groups, some of which are closed off, so we don't even know what's being discussed. And I don't know whether or not we have enough of a interest. It's always weird with Africa, because when Spotify wants to do its IPO, it'll open up in Africa as well to bump its numbers up. But the attention is never fully turned on us, even though there's over 1.3 billion people here. I just don't get it.
Yeah.
I just don't get it.
It is.
Oh, go ahead.
No, it is frustrating. And as I say, it's on one hand, there are all kinds of opportunities that open up, but on the other hand, you have to remain vigilant and keep an eye on the way that these platforms reinforce the same problem that they supposedly solve.
Let me ask you something. Do you think that the recent move by Spotify to acquire Joe Rogan for, the licensing rights for the number of years that they did, $400 million US, which is like almost 2 trillion, not 2 trillion, 2 billion rands. Do you think that that will change the interest and appetite in podcasting in Africa? Because I remember when people started making lots of money, not locally, but when people started finding out that YouTube is a revenue-making stream, the South African interest then started. And I think South Africa is only entering its YouTube era maybe this year and last year, if I'm being generous.
Yeah.
Do you think that podcasting moment is yet to come? Or do you think this is not really going to change much?
I think it is. I think we will see an explosion of digital content on the continent. It may even be the epicenter of digital content in the world on the continent, given um, given the expectation that data prices in places like South Africa, for example, would come down eventually. Um, and the YouTube space in South Africa is just so fascinating. Everything from traditional medicine, where you'll find tens of thousands of views for any one piece of content, to this weird right-wing, alt-right world that's developing, to major players now also trying to enter the digital space. So I do think that we are about to witness a fundamental transformation in the way that we consume content, and that throws up all kinds of opportunities and dangers.
I hear you. Let me ask you something though, which is off the digital framework. Do South Africans still read? Some people may or may not know that you've written an award-winning book, Democracy and Delusion. It's a good book. I've given it to my students who I debate coach in various high schools. But I want to ask you, do you think the reading culture still exists?
It's funny because I think that there's a growing reading culture and not necessarily a growing literary culture in the technical sense of books and books being widely read. So I think that if you look at the sheer amount that people are reading on, exactly as we were saying, Twitter, social media, even YouTube, WhatsApp, text messages, you've seen a great growth, I think, in the way that people communicate via text and via reading. And I think that's a really exciting literary space in and of itself. And of course, then there's the new oral literary space of audiobooks and podcasts, which itself, I think, echoes an African tradition in many ways, which is now spreading to the West. Yeah. But then in terms of the book and the novel itself, I think it's still not clear whether those are going to be dying forms that will evolve, or whether they themselves will retain their salience. I think they've pretty much remained stable. So for example, a best-selling book in South Africa sells 5,000 copies, and that's not bad, but it's also not like a million.
Yeah, I've always thought like that it's just a weird reality that our numbers of consumption are not that high. I don't know. What are your thoughts having this book and that was very celebrated? Did you get that it was widely read, or did you get that it was still within the ballpark of the South African book?
I think it was in the ballpark of the South African book. It surprised the publisher because it did sell quite well, as I say, around the 5,000 mark, which proved that there's a generation of particularly young Black readers out there who are eager and hungry to consume information in that form. But I always am frustrated with the reach, and I always want to find ways, or try to find ways to extend it. And I think that's the interesting thing at the moment is it's no longer just about a book anymore. It's about how you can extend that book. Do you create a podcast around the book? Do you create a series of videos? I had music that accompanied the book. So I think there are really interesting things that are happening with extending work into different realms. And those opportunities are different now than they were before, where it was just about the one book or the one album.
All right, I hear you. What advice would you have for young people who are looking at creating knowledge, whether it's books, podcasts, that kind of thing, YouTube channels? Because you clearly are a creator. There's a body of work now following you. What would you say to young people listening to this particular podcast?
I think one of the things I would say is that quality matters in terms of sound quality, in terms of video quality. There's a great deal of work that goes into making something look or sound visually appealing, which is a technical matter, but I think it's going to be increasingly important, and it's increasingly available for this new generation. So if you are interested in going into that world, it's important that you collaborate with artistic and technical minds that can bring those ideas into reality. That's number one. Number two, I've really learned the importance of the consistency of content. I used to be of the school, like, rather just release one really good thing every 2 months, But actually, I think developing a catalog and an archive is more important than just doing one really good thing, because people can always go back to your archive. So, for example, now during the lockdown in South Africa during COVID-19, it's been very difficult to do face-to-face interviews, which is a key part of SMWX.
Yeah.
But people have still gone back to watch our videos because we have an archive. So you've got to, instead of thinking about making a perfect piece of content, make a good piece of content, but make a lot of good pieces of content, and that will build itself over time and become self-sustaining.
All right, that's good advice. I think it's very useful. Are there any podcasters that you particularly like, or people who are, examples? For me, I think about, is his name Ezra Klein? Ezra Klein is one of the guys that I think of. And there's this guy from Gimlet Media, whose name I can't remember right now. But he was also acquired by Spotify. But he's interesting because he did this. He recorded how he was making the business of making a podcast company. And then that became a movie. And then the company actually got acquired by Spotify for $200 million. But I really enjoyed how Gimlet Media created content over the years. And obviously Vox as a media company, which Ezra Klein, I think, has been part of from the beginning. Those two are my guys. But I don't know if you have anybody that you would recommend other people watch or try to model themselves around, whether it's locally
for sure.
or globally.
Well, I'm watching with interest what you come up to, because I think you have a great opportunity to build a fascinating platform for real. So I'm watching with bated breath on that front.
Thank you.
My podcast and media consumption, digital media consumption, is quite interesting. So I listen to, I go with what I really love. So I think the algorithms are just so confused with my consumption.
Yeah, they don't know what to give you.
Exactly. 1 minute, I listen to a lot of football related content. And I think there's a lot of interesting stuff happening in the fan media space, which kind of disrupts the centralized dissemination of like a Sky Sports or whatever, or a Super Sport. You now have, I want to listen to it from a specific perspective.
Yeah.
So
who's your football guy?
Really, I'm a big Liverpool fan, so I listen to a lot of the Liverpool media, from Redmen TV to the Anfield Index.
Well, this is your year, apparently. I should have known things were going to go upside down as soon as Liverpool was so high up on the log standings, because that never happens. That should have been the sign that this year is going upside down. This is Liverpool only wins in upside down years.
COVID-19 tried to take the title from us, but we
Liverpool winning is what created the COVID-19 crisis. This is the upside down that we're in right now.
Oh wow!
And Liverpool is, you guys broke the what do they call those things? The time portal or whatever, the portal. You took us through to the other side.
Oh man! Wow! So now the algorithm's like, okay, this is a football fan.
Yeah.
Then I listen. Then there's a lot of academic stuff that I like listening to. So I think universities are starting to do interesting things with theorists and thinkers, stuff like that. So various universities have cool podcasts.
Which ones are your top two?
One. Well, I'll cheat and say I'm working on one with Wiser from Wits. Where we bring like African theorists into the podcast space, and I'm really excited about that prospect.
And when
there's
is that
one
coming
from out? It's on to its 5th episode, so it's just started.
All right, so I'll post a link about that as well in the notes and stuff, so that people can find that SMWX as well. And you were saying there's another one?
Yeah, the New York Institute for Humanities does an interesting set of podcasts. So yeah, I could go on. There are lots of interesting writing podcasts. So, I listen to a lot of stuff about writing.
Oh, that's cool. Give us some plugs. Give us some plugs. Like the funny thing is that people always go check, and you never know. Eclectic tastes actually are some of the most rich in terms of like you break people's thought patterns, right? So for instance, I love Stephen A. Smith, and I'm not an athlete, but I enjoy watching the NBA debates. And I realized why later on is that because they're so numbers driven, so there's no space to create false narratives about people in the sport, because everyone's stats are accessible. So you have to debate within the confines of the numbers. So I think when I try to think about why do I enjoy watching this stuff, that was because I don't actually watch NBA games, but I watch all of these debates about the NBA. So go ahead, hit us with the writing plugs.
There's a cool writing podcast that I listen to called The Writer Files, where they interview different writers about their process, which I find fascinating as a writer. That's an American one. There's also a British one called The Writing Life, which is kind of similar.
Very cool.
So I mean, sometimes you listen to podcasts to try and develop a skill, or, and there's another interesting world of like personal development podcasts or nutrition based podcasts. And then there's also, I mean, I like I can be a political hack sometimes. And of course, and I think this is going to start happening more in South Africa as well, where you can hear radio shows going into podcasts. But
yes, I've seen that as well happening.
I like I listen to a lot of US political podcasts. So like, the 538 podcast.
538, yes, I'm a big fan of 538. Although I think Nate Silver sometimes is a bit too dismissive, because he's like, I don't have to explain myself to idiots. And I'm like, oh, no, Nate, so you're not going to be right 100% of the time. Give us the explanation so that we can measure whether it's of value or not. It's just like one episode where you say that, and I still remember it.
Yeah, no, I know it's like you bring different parts of yourself to these different things. So like I'll listen to Hacks on Tap, for example, which is with David Axelrod and
that's
Mike
a good
Murphy.
one.
Yeah, and I'm just like, I love the intrigue of politics, but at the same time, I have fairly radical views on race which aren't represented there. So
I understand.
You take it for what it is, and you bring parts of yourself to it, and you get different parts. But as you can see, I think that the market in South Africa, I'm not a big fan of the South African Podcast Network. There's the Cheeky Natives, which I think is great for literature, but there are still very few progressive-minded podcasts that I could really resonate with. So I think that's a wide open space that we need to fill.
It's very new. Yeah, it needs a lot of development. Let me close off by asking you about knowledge creation from a musical perspective, because you are a rapper, and people don't know, and maybe they do know, that you were actually in a group with AKA. So you've been rapping for a long time. I want to ask you what
I taught AKA how to rap. Yeah.
You taught him his chops, so to speak. So people should blame you or praise you depending on what they think. But tell me something. What role do you think music is playing in knowledge formation in this particular era? During these protests, I was listening to some of the music that was actually being released during the protests. And one of the ones that stuck out for me was from Run the Jewels, this song called Just, which Pharrell, also helped Mike, what's his name? Killer Mike and them make. And, I thought it was such a poetic song, because they're talking about how you've got all these master's degrees and all of this, and you still have the slave masters on your dollars, and you need to, look at all the slave masters posing on your dollars and stuff. And it struck me that they were actually creating knowledge for the movement, because the timing of the drop in the middle of a Black Lives Matter protest, Apple Music was streaming the same playlist across the world. And I thought that was an interesting way that Killer Mike was able to get a point across around the continuation of slavery within the capitalist system and how very few people are reflecting on it. But then it got me thinking, is Black music still creating knowledge in the way that it did? Or have I always over-assumed that it does? I don't know if you get what I'm trying to say.
No, I get you. I get you totally. And again, I have mixed feelings. You know, on the one hand, I'm growing quite cynical about celebrity culture, both globally and in South Africa. I think that it's developed in the social media age into this hyper materialistic, like flaunting within a sea of inequality, which, oh man, I just can't imagine how people on the other side of the divide, you know, feel when they see that. But at the same time, art, which sometimes is linked to celebrity culture, is always a crucial venue for reshaping the way people see the world. And I think while, you know, you can write something, or as you well know, while you can give a sound argument for something, reaching people at the rational and the intellectual level is only one dimension of who they are. And I think art has the ability to change how they see the world and how they feel about the world. And that's also key. So it's a key site of struggle. It's a site that's trying to be co-opted, as always, by various forces. But there's a lot of beautiful stuff. If you search hard enough, like you say, you can find things now that just speak to you in ways that you can't imagine. And there are all kinds of new forms of art blossoming underneath this mono celebrity culture.
Okay, so the last question I have for you before we have to wrap this out is, do you think that South African rap is still political, or was it ever political? Or what role do you think it currently plays, and how can it get political if it isn't?
So I've gone through different phases on this. I've gone through the phase where I thought, you know what, like these rappers in South Africa have just lost the plot, basically, and that it's just all become about a very patriarchal way of boasting, basically. But there's explicitly political music, and then there's music which is political in the way that it expresses everyday life. And I think that rap, even in its commercial form, plays that role. So if you look at the big commercial players, in speaking to people's aspirations, they reveal a lot about what people care about in society. And if you look at rappers now, you can see the tension of South African society, because on the one hand, they still want to claim some allegiance to the liberation movement, but they also want to drive Bentleys.
Yes, there's a tension.
And that's the tension we all face, right? We have the opportunity for material advantage like never before, but we also feel certain political obligations. And I think rap uniquely and hip-hop uniquely expresses the tensions that we're feeling. So it's not as explicitly political as I would like, even though there are some great examples like Dope St. Jude or a lot of Stogie T stuff. But even in its crass form, I think it still says a lot about our society and reflects society back at us in important ways. And again, as I say, the patriarchal nature of it also shows a number of the problems that we have with the kind of masculinities that are developed in South Africa today.
No, I get you, and I totally agree with you. So I think we're going to have to cut it off. I've kept you way longer than I said I would. But thanks so much for giving us some of your time, and we could talk all day. I have way more questions than this, but I try to focus and stay on the topic.
We'll do a relay. You come on SMWX, I do an interview with you. We'll just keep doing it.
Yeah, we can do it that way. Thanks so much, my brother. Thanks so much.
Okay, brother. Peace out.